the most successful governance model in Africa has been coalitions.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Constitution at Work podcast. Today, I am joined by my colleagues, Christo from Rheede, the FW de Klerk Foundation's Executive Director, as well as Ismail, the Foundation's Constitutional Advancement Program Manager. I am Daniela Ellerbeck. I am an attorney and the manager of the Foundation's Constitutional Rights Program. And our special guest is Professor William Gumede. We will be discussing coalition government today. South Africa's GNU turned 1 year old and seems to still be holding it together. Professor, welcome to the show. Perhaps tell our listeners how you became involved in the study of politics and coalitions in particular.
Thank you. I'm very excited to talk to you about the Government of National Unity and coalitions in general. I'm a professor of practice at the School of Governance at Wits University and also the founder of the Democracy Works Foundation, who's now just over 10 years old. And I established it 10 years ago to try to do two things. One, if you remember, it was the Jacob Zuma presidency, which was not good for South Africa. It really broke our economy and broke the state. And I initially set up Democracy Works to try to influence the political system and the ANC to try to find an alternative to Jacob Zuma. But the second part of it is my worry at the time was that as the economy declined, people often blamed democracy for the reasons that they're unemployed, they can't find a job, or that the education system is not working, and so on. And I thought it would be very, very important to set up a dedicated organization, firstly to defend democracy and to help strengthen democratic institutions, but also to support civil society organizations, also from a capacity, finance, and so on. And most importantly, I'm a great believer personally in the idea of a government of national unity. I'm a very strong believer in Nelson Mandela's government of national unity as a model for us in South Africa to continue to have, but also as a model to other African countries. And my argument essentially is that even if parties win elections, they get a majority in divided societies, it would be very useful if they bring in other parties to co-govern with them, even if they have a majority. And that's also the whole idea of a government of national unity.
I fully agree with the concept of a coalition government, but also you cannot have a coalition government that is fraught with major ideological differences. So you want at least those parties that are part of a coalition to be aligned in terms of ideology. And I think what is significant of South Africa that we've seen sort of 4 scenarios playing out last year during our national election in terms of ideological positioning. So on the one hand, you had the right wing, if I may use that term, sort of resurfacing. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have had the left, and I call them the intellectual left that has never gained momentum in South Africa. And then you've got the populist Africanist scenario of Jacob Zuma, of Julius Malema, and some of those elements are within the ANC. And the MK has gained a massive support base during last year's election. That's the coalition that we need to worry about. And then you've got the moderates, in other words, the pragmatists, the constitutionalists. And that for me is the 4th scenario where I think our GNU is making headways, and I think there's people there that can make it work. But I don't think they really understand the importance of having an aligned ideological framework. Yes, the Declaration of Intent provides that, but it seems to me they don't care. Is everyone just for themselves? And they actually pose a massive risk for South Africa. You can just imagine if either of the other 3 scenarios gain momentum, what kind of trouble we will be in. So I don't know, Prof, whether you agree with my analysis of the different ideological scenarios at play currently in South Africa.
Just the first thing, just to say that coalitions are very good in diverse societies. Like South Africa, we're one of the world's most diverse societies, and coalition government is good. In fact, it's a perfect fit. And I know a lot of ordinary citizens ask me about whether coalition type of government is workable in our diverse society and with our diverse politics. I tell them that if we look at the evidence since the Second World War in both developing countries, also Africa, but also in Western countries, coalitions has been good for growth in many, many countries. So starting off, for example, if you think about in Brazil, I mean, they've had coalitions since 1990 of 10, 11, 12 parties in a coalition. And often it doesn't really matter the ideology, if there are ideological differences. The most important thing is that people believe in, for example, the constitution of the country. There's a constitutionalism. It's much more important than, for example, ideology. Take you to just in Brazil, for example, to the current coalition, sort of over 10 or so political parties in their coalition. And the pillar of their coalition is the Workers' Party of Lula da Silva. That's the left of center. But in their coalition, they have parties to the far right, for example, Catholic parties that are anti-abortion and so on. So it's a spectrum of ideology. And the interesting part of it, they've had coalitions, I mean, since the 90s. And if you think about Brazil had a military rule since 1958 for all of that period until the 1990s. And Brazil's economic miracle happened only when they started having these broad-based coalitions. But I think the most important thing that held those coalitions together was the idea of Brazil as a constitutional country and so on, and they differed around economics and even on other issues. We can take it closer to home with us in Mauritius, for example. If you think about it, Mauritius started off in 1968, also as a typical post-liberation African country. It had a big liberation movement called the Labour Party, which was sort of left of center. And in the first 10 years of their government was sadly as bad as the ANC was as a dominant part in many African liberation movements that comes into power. The first couple of years was just where, poor governance, corruption, not governing in the interests of all of society, often having ideological policies, anti-business, cadre deployment, which then destroyed the state services. So they had typically the same type of, let's call it your post-liberation story when you have a dominant party coming to government that do not govern in the interest of everyone. And the thing about Mauritius, which makes them a very exciting comparison, is they also a diverse society, almost as diverse as South Africa. And then what then happened by the early 1970s, the Labour Party gets voted out by coalition. So subsequent to sort of the early 70s, Mauritius has had coalitions all the way until present. And the success story of Mauritius with these coalition governments, I mean, they have been in Africa's post-Second World War history, certainly, I think, the most successful African countries, consistently 7, 8, 9% growth rates, stability, and so on. And you have to realize where they came from. Just a couple of months before independence, they had an ethnic massacre. And most people thought that Mauritius will not survive as a country because of the extreme ethnic diversity. And at that time, at independence, it was the second poorest African country. And then it had sort of a decade of liberation dominance, which actually took them closer to the brink of potential breakup, ethnic divisions, low growth, violence, unemployment, and so on. And then people actually voted out the liberation movement, and they brought in a coalition which changed the game. So even closer to home. And Botswana, at the end of colonialism, first period was a government of national unity. They brought in the smaller parties to co-govern. And again, Botswana is, from an African point of view, our second best run country since independence, because they try to be as inclusive as possible from the start, and they build a culture of inclusivity. Now, even in recent times, in societies in Africa, when they put together coalitions to govern at national level, those coalitions actually have done better than during periods of one-party rule or even military rule. The most successful governance model in Africa has been coalitions. And now if I move you out of Africa and out of the developing world, I mean, in Western Europe, the German miracle has been based on coalition governance. For all of the post-war period in Germany, it only has had one national government that was not a coalition. So just to imagine, since 1945, since the end of the Second World War, the rebuilding rebuilding of Germany, the reconstruction of Germany, and the German miracle has just been work coalitions. So coalition government has been one of the most effective system of governance in the post-Second World War. Think about Scandinavian countries of Sweden and so on, and places like Finland. It's been coalition government that's actually produce the great welfare state, the social democratic welfare state also. So it doesn't matter the ideology. It could be ideology on the left, ideology on the right, or in the center. So that coalitions is very good for countries that come out of a conflict. It is very good for countries that are divided, and it's very good for countries that have to deal with a massive crisis. Now let's go home. What is happening with the government of national unity? I think if you look at the last year of the government of national unity, despite all of the problems that they are experiencing, it has still been better than the 5 years of the ANC government. I think that is very important to emphasize that. People often forget that. It has given society a sense of hope, despite the fact that it's not a perfect government. People are much more hopeful. Then, secondly, from an accountability point of view, it gives us better options to hold the government accountable. When we had an ANC as a dominant majority government, it was very difficult to enforce accountability because the ANC was so complacent, because voters kept on voting for it. The ANC didn't need to bother to be accountable because it knew whatever it did, whether it failed, whether it was corrupt or whether it was incompetent, it didn't matter because it will still get, at the end of the day, majority votes. Now, for the first time, the party is feeling it. And I think that is important because the dividend of democracy, I mean, the beauty for me of democracy is that accountability dividend. But the accountability dividend can only happen if voters vote based on performance of a party, not voting based on the past or based on color or based on ethnic group. So the ANC had a very, very good period of 30 years where voters voted for it based on the past. Because voters voted for it based on the past, the voters did not get the accountability dividends of democracy. And that unfortunately happens in many developing countries. I mean, in 2016, I was advisor to UNESCO's 2016 Global Inequality Report, where we looked at almost every country that is not in a war and looks at their stability, economic growth, how they deal with issues like inequalities and so on. And one issue that has undermined developing countries growing or transforming positively is in instances where you have a party that's governing, but its voters vote for it based on ethnic considerations or based on past consideration and not based on the present and performance. So those type of countries almost never get the growth that they want to get. They don't get the dividend of democracy. So even if they have elections, they're not getting it because there's no accountability. Because you need to get the accountability in. A society must hold a government accountable and must be able to vote out a government based on the present in order to get that dividend of democracy. So we haven't had the dividend of democracy up to now because citizens are not holding the government accountable. So the government have a free pass essentially because they know, well, actually, however they govern, they will always get supported. So the fact that we now have a national coalition government and that clearly we've crossed the Rubicon where people clearly don't vote for parties anymore exclusively based on the past. I mean, we still have, sadly, too many people still voting based on color and based on the past. But we're getting closer to the point where people are holding parties much more accountable. That in itself is a very, very important moment in our politics. And the GNU in itself, I think, also offers us something else. It offers us a potential to realign our politics away from the liberation era politics. Up to now, we have had the ANC, when the ANC was dominant, was almost the liberation era where people voted for the ANC based on its liberation past. So that's a liberation era. Now, the GNU offers a break. The GNU offers a realignment from the liberation era, possibly towards a post-liberation era. How could it happen? A lot of our political parties are still based on the liberation era, which include ethnic parties. Spin-offs from the ANC, for example, are still articulating their visions based on the liberation struggle. So unfortunately, those type of politics is not yet the the politics for a democracy, for the kind of democracy that we want. What we need in our democracy, we need a realignment of our politics where we get the parties that are constitutional based should align. We want to create a new center of constitutionalism. But I think the GNU offers that because in the GNU are majority constitutionalist parties. I think there's a real possibilities that those parties could potentially actually be the basis of a future coalition on their own. And then what we could have, the populists having their own coalition, and those could include even populist factions of the ANC. And then the moderates and the constitutional people in the ANC could form part of a pro-constitutionalist GNU type of new coalition. I think there is that real possibility, almost where the DA and the Ramaphosa constitutional wing of the ANC could form into a permanent coalition. For me, that's the great potential.
Prof, you spoke about this accountability dividend, and I really want to touch on that, not so much in how voters hold parties to account, but how parties in the GNU hold each other to account. And I mention this because we saw the fallout with that, with the budget, with the DA taking the ANC to court, and that caused quite a tension. How do you envisage parties wearing the duality cap of being party in government, but at the same time wanting as well to be an opposition party? Is that still possible?
You know, the big risk of the GNU now is the fact that the ANC was for 30 years the majority party, and its policies in the past became the government policies. So it is still thinking that it is still the majority party. And that's the risk, and that's been the challenge for the non-ANC partners in the GNU. How to persuade the ANC to change the culture from a majority-based thinking culture and decision-making culture into a consensus and inclusive culture after 30 years of the ANC's majority culture. And it's not just 30 years of the ANC's majority culture. As a liberation movement, the ANC's political culture was majority-based culture. The philosophy of if you're the majority, your view becomes the government's view. Now, in a democracy, it doesn't work. In a democracy, it's not a majority view. It is the view that is firstly constitutional. So sometimes a majority is not constitutional. Or secondly, it would be, is it in the widest public interest of the country? Now, sometimes, again, a majority view is not necessarily in the widest interest of the country. And that really has been the struggle of the ANC's liberation movement, to move from majoritarianism as a concept, as a culture, as a political culture, to inclusive governance, to govern in the widest interest of the country and society, which is not the same as the ANC's interests and the country's interests are not the same, to get that. And that's been the difficulty of the non-ANC partner, because yeah, they're in the GNU now. And the ANC, for example, says, well, you in the GNU, because we've invited you into the GNU, we are still the majority party, and all of our policies is the GNU policies. So there's a misunderstanding. And it's not only the GNU, many ordinary South Africans also think that this is still an ANC government, but now with partners. No, this is a new government. And then a new government must come up with new policies. So in a new government, you can't have the past policies. If there are policies that are contested, they have to be re-looked at. And quite interestingly, in many our municipal coalitions that fail, they often fail on the basis of this, that the parties that have the majority think that they are the majority party in municipal coalitions, and then they force their policies through, and that collapses the municipal coalitions. In fact, that's been at the heart of the collapse of most of our municipal coalitions, is the fact that the party with the majority votes cannot come to terms with the fact that it has a majority vote, but it is governing in a coalition with others and where it is equal with others, despite the fact that it has the majority. And that is an important thing. So the reason why the GNU up to now has struggled is that the ANC has been unable to move from that majority culture to an inclusive culture. Almost the ANC is repeating the mistakes that it has been making at municipal coalition level. But not only the ANC, but we've seen it many other dominant parties at the local level. When they're in a coalition, they think they are actually the strongest party. Now, how should the non-ANC partners respond to this, to sort of ANC majority decision making? One way, because South Africa is a constitutional democracy, and we're not a parliamentary democracy, we're not a presidential democracy. This means we can actually change political culture through the courts. So the fact that the DA took the budget, for example, to the court or threatened to take the budget to the court, it was a good thing. Because they failed to get the ANC to govern inclusively and consult with them and with the other partners, the only option left was to go to court. And I think that's the beauty of our constitutional democracy. Political culture can be changed by going to the courts.
Prof, the last thing then is, Helen Zille made a comment just the other day that the clearinghouse mechanism of the GNU isn't working. How do we strengthen this GNU as it currently stands?
You know, the multi-party charter, when I chaired it, we put a couple of things together for in the event that the multi-party charter would be in government. And one of the things was a conflict resolution mechanism. And that conflict resolution mechanism was moved into the GNU. Now, the sad part of it is the conflict resolution mechanism has not been implemented in a way it should be implemented. For example, the last time it met was in November last year. Secondly, for a mechanism like that to work, and the way we envisaged it in the MPC was that the person who chairs that mechanism cannot come from the party with the most votes. It must either come from the party with the least votes, or it must be an external ombuds who is not a member of any of the parties. That is the only way it could function. What happened is the ANC appointed Paul Masatile, which is the deputy president of the ANC, as the head of that. It can't work that way. You can't have, as the head of a conflict resolution mechanism of a coalition government, you can't have them in the party with the most votes, its member to chair it. It must either go to the party with the least votes, or it must go to an external person. And I think that has been one of the reasons why it has failed. Because Paul Masatile, because he comes from the ANC, how's he going to manage, how is he going to be a neutral arbiter?
I think you've given us a lot of food for thought, in terms of the benefits of a coalition in anticipation of the next election, local elections and the national elections. How do we inculcate a greater understanding of coalition and how it should work? And the fact that it is not a added on, it's complete new party, and it's required of that new party to come up with new solutions to the challenges that we face. Because your party, office bearers, your politicians, your local population, the electorate, many people do not understand this concept of a coalition. And what do you think, what can one do to really bring that across, that this is a possible solution for the quagmire that we find ourselves in?
I think as civil society, what we need to do is educate society and even Independent Electoral Commission as part of voter education that coalitions is part and parcel of democracy. It is not something alien. It should become part and part of our political culture, and it is here to stay, and it's a good thing. In fact, that is the best thing. There's a lot of work to be done from civil society, and civil society includes even business, the media, and also political parties themselves have to educate their members.
Prof, you have mentioned that coalitions in municipalities fail because parties fail to move from a majoritarian culture to an inclusive culture. Now, I specifically want to focus on municipalities because the poor city of Johannesburg citizens have had a coalition local government since the last local government elections in 2021. And the citizens of Joburg have faced many problems because of the political instability that has led to 5 mayors in as many years. And this resulted in severe service delivery problems. So there are those that are critics to coalition governments because coalition governments in the city of Johannesburg have led to instability, policy paralysis, inability for the executive to actually do their job. Now, to amend this problem of shaky municipal government coalitions, the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, which I will just call COGTA, opened up a draft bill for comment last year, commonly known as the Coalition Bill. Now, many people commented on the bill, of which the foundation was one. And then later that year, there was also a private member's bill by a member of parliament, which also tries to resolve the problem of unstable municipal coalitions. Now, the COGTA department's coalition bill wanted to make coalition agreements binding, so to find what a coalition agreement is and then make it binding, and require hung municipalities with mayoral executive systems to change to a collective executive system. So for our listeners and viewers, this is where the executive power is vested in an executive council, an exco, as opposed to an individual person, an executive mayor. And they also wanted to set out the grounds for removal of municipal office bearers from office, because again, what has happened in Johannesburg is the revolving door of mayors. Now, the private members bill that was also open for comment later that year proposes to resolve the same problem, but it aims to only allow for a single notice of intention to move for a motion for the removal of a speaker, a whip, or executive mayor per year. So if you're unhappy with the mayor of Joburg, who is an executive mayor, you can only have one notice for a motion of removal against that mayor annually, to try and achieve some stability so that you don't have this revolving door of mayors. And then on top of that, the bill proposed requiring the establishment of an independent panel who must determine the motion's preliminary validity. Now, in your perspective, what mechanisms can be put in place to ensure stable coalition governments in municipalities, but also provincially and nationally?
Just to start off, just to say that our problem really is not necessarily the laws. Our problem is one of political culture. I mean, we think about Johannesburg. Firstly, it starts off with voters. We really have to get voters to stop voting for individuals just based on populism, based on the past, based on ethnic issues, and so on, and get them to vote, particularly at a local level, based on competence. I mean, if you're going to vote in someone who's never ever run anything in their life, not even as far as a sock, we're going to have problems. And unfortunately, that's been the case in Johannesburg. We're getting populist councillors getting voted in based not on any competence or performance or prior performance or other things they've done in their life and so on. And that has been the outcome, sadly. I mean, I think during the apartheid era, when councillors was sort of a semi-voluntary sort of thing and people had a day job, it somehow was much more better because you had more quality type of individuals, professionals and so on. And now, because voters have been voting for people who's at local level, their politics is their sole income. It has caused some of the problems, in particularly Johannesburg. It starts off with voting. And then secondly, also, ordinary citizens are just not doing enough at a local level to hold their councillors accountable. Because, at a local level, you actually know your councillors a little bit more than at a national level. So there is an opportunity to do that. And for me, the third one, which is very, very exciting, is two new pieces of legislation, not legislation. One was a court judgment that said that publicly elected officials can be held accountable in their personal capacity. So I think ordinary citizens at a local level should use that to hold people accountable. So I think the first one, just to say, I believe very strongly that the coalition agreements must be binding. I mean, obviously, it's very difficult to do that because it is a political agreement. Whether one can say a political agreement can become a legal agreement. But I think we have to find a middle way where we can hold the parties accountable for once they signed to these agreements so that they don't willy-nilly, for superficial reasons, quit. Secondly, we also have to make these agreements public. So it's transparent. So citizens, local communities, and the public understand what's happening and what the parties sign up to. So that's really very important. So in fact, when we say if we want to make it binding, we also have to say it must be transparent. Then the whole issue about motions of no confidence, because it really is an issue. So how do we limit it, but without undermining the democratic process? Because at the end of the day, a vote of no confidence is part of the democratic process. So I would go for some kind of tribunal type of option as a structure to look at the merits of a motion. So then it doesn't constrain the democratic right of any elected official or political party to push for a vote of no confidence, but we make a vote of no confidence more serious. Because up to now, it has been very superficial. It's just been used really deliberately to undermine, to end the government.
Prof, it is very heartening to hear you say that because it echoes quite a few of the proposals and recommendations that the foundation made. So amongst other things, we, for example, said the coalition agreements must be made public because these are public office bearers who will be responsible accountable for executive power that the Constitution gives them on our behalf and that they need to exercise on our behalf within the constraints of the Constitution. We also said coalition agreements should be legally binding.
I mean, the other thing, which is also a big reason for failure of coalitions at the local level and which is a danger to GNU, is the public administration. Now, when we look at in more mature democracies, you could have long periods where there are no coalition governments, but the governments still function. Now, why does that happen? It happens because the public administration is competent and is professional. And the public administration is not accountable to the politicians, but accountable to the constitutional mandates. And that's very important. In our political culture, public administrations, because the ANC has been a majority and the members has been sort of cadre deployed into the public administration, they've seen the public administration as accountable to the governing party, not accountable to the constitution. So what we need to do as we reform the way coalitions operate, we must also make absolutely certain that the public administration, whether at a municipal level or provincial or national level, are professionalized. So we must have it as part of the reforms, not as a separate part of reforms. For example, what we need to do is to say that appointments of the public administration executives at a local level or even at a national level must be based on merit and must be open and transparent. And I think there's a really nice opportunity now that we have coalition politics to make it merit. You know, when the ANC was a majority party, it was very, very difficult because the ANC would force its cadres to be appointed. Now that we have coalition politics so widespread, there's a real opportunity to bring merit-based appointments into the executive at that level, because we now have multiple parties in coalition. So now we can do it and so on. So we have to use this opportunity as we push for the reforms, coalition reforms, to say, let's enforce merit-based appointments to the executive, like municipal managers. These people should be non-political, should not be political party appointees, should not be cadres appointed, but they should be there based on merit. And then related to that, we must also say, well, in the case when the coalition collapse, we need to empower the executive, the public administration executive, to be able to continue to govern based on constitutional values. I think if we do that, it will also help us to change our administrative culture, because right now, sadly, our administrative culture has become very unprofessional because it has become so politicized by cadre appointments and loyalty to party rather than the constitution. When the parties, like when the ANC was in trouble and it has had his internal squabbles, it also undermined the public service because the public service had become the extension of the ANC. This is an absolutely great opportunity now to depoliticize the public administration at a local, provincial, and at a national level.
Prof, thank you so much for that. I want to touch on the idea that hung municipalities should move towards a collective executive system if they are an executive mayoral system. So they should move from where the executive power is vested in the mayor to a system where a municipality's executive authority is vested collectively in an exco.
Sadly, so at our local level, because the ANC has been a majority party, in the last couple of years, the national presidency has become very executive. Although we've got a constitutional democracy, constitutional democracy is not an executive presidency, but since for the last 30 years, our national president has functioned like executive presidency, although it is not an executive presidency. And unfortunately, that has gone downwards to the premiers and downwards to the mayors also, where it's become executive mayors, almost executive premiers also. So it's been a function of our political culture rather than a function of our laws. So I would be much more in favor of diversifying the power to the executives rather than having the sort of executive mayor with all of the powers. The great opportunity now, since we have coalition governments, that we now can spread the power and diversify the power across the executives, not only at local level and the provincial provincial level, even at a national level, because if you think about it, President Ramaphosa still operates as if he's executive president. And a lot of people and ordinary citizens think it's executive presidency. We don't have executive presidency. We're supposed to have a much more consensus model, even a consensus presidency, and power was supposed to be much more dispersed to our cabinet at a national level, but similarly also at a provincial level and also at a municipal level.
Prof, please could you differentiate between exactly what an executive presidency is and what you were saying we're supposed to be modeled, which is a consensus-based presidency?
So, many democracies have presidential elections. So that is almost like that one could say is executive presidency because, any individual goes out there, campaigns across the country, like in the US, the people vote and the person becomes a president. And then the person puts together a cabinet, right? So because the person got a mandate to become the president directly from people who voted, it makes it almost an executive president who can then appoint and govern the cabinets at the discretion of the president. So what we have is that the president is elected through parliament and then bring together his cabinet from parliament. So that's not an executive presidency. So it means that parliament, for example, can recall the president. Whereas if you're an executive presidency, it's very difficult to do that. You have to wait until the next elections unless you impeach the president. So that's very important to understand the nuances and the difference. Unfortunately, we've now become used to the idea almost of executive presidency. I mean, just coming back to this executive president, the president now appoints so many people. Almost all the CEOs, for example, of state-owned entities. Can we allow the president to appoint almost every CEO of all of the state entities? That's actually been one of the reasons of why state capture has been so devastating and so tough, because one individual can appoint not only all of cabinet, but can also appoint all of the executives and chairs of state-owned entities. So if that individual appoints corrupt and incompetent people, the whole system of government collapse into failure. And this is why we have had failures so quickly and so devastatingly. If it was executive presidency, that was supposed to happen. And I think that's the problem. So we possibly will have to relook at the presidency itself. Has it worked for us? Firstly, just the way the presidency is operated, is it appropriate? What do we do going onwards? How do we make certain that it is not an executive presidency, but it is a consensus presidency? And I think that is very, very important. But it's not only the presidency at the national level, but also the mayor system and at the premier system. And I think this is a great opportunity because we're talking coalitions now.
Prof, you raised some really, really good points there. I know many people have voiced concern about what will happen at the next NEC and if Cyril will face the same consequences as Thabo Mbeki faced. And then that also takes me back to, for example, hung municipalities, because forcing municipalities where an executive mayor has power to actually achieve something, to be in a coalition, forcing them to now suddenly convert into a forced coalition would only hamper service delivery. So again, this takes us back to actually how do we get stable coalitions that actually further the objective of municipalities as per the Constitution? Because I do want to remind our listeners that the Constitution actually has a lot to say about the objectives of a municipality. And one of those is to provide democratic and accountable government, to ensure the provision of services in a sustainable manner to that community, to promote social and economic development, and to promote a safe and healthy environment, and to encourage the involvement of communities and community organizations in the matters of local government. So this is what a municipality, according to the Constitution, is supposed to do. Now, forcing hung municipalities into forced coalitions, and then they face unstable coalition politics. How do we get stable coalitions? What do you think enforcement mechanisms could look like for enforcing coalition agreements on the political parties?
If we introduce a couple of the proposed reforms, making agreements binding, limit some of the motions of no confidence, but not limit it in a democratic way, or rather have oversight over it, external oversight, bring ordinary citizens, must hold elected representatives accountable for waste, accountable for corruption in their personal capacity. So for people to use that, what we need to do is ordinary citizens must be involved much more at a local level. There are democratic structures. We need to get people to get involved there. And then lastly, we have to get people to begin to elect different kinds of people. I mean, I think it almost starts with that. How do people must see the people they elect at a local level look at competence first. So, and not party, and not because, well, he or she is my friend or my family member or my ethnic group or my color, I'm going to vote for that person. To look at the person's competence and honesty and those sort of things is almost a shift in the way people assess what is a political leader. And of course, we have to do quite a lot of work as civil society and the media, people to begin to look differently at what is political leadership. I mean, as a society, sadly, a majority of people, or maybe not a majority, but a large number of people think political leadership is all about shouting slogans, attacking others, being a revolutionary, and so on. I mean, if citizens elect those type of people will harm them, will harm their interests. Those are not quality political leaders. So political leaders, and particularly at the local level, is the first thing that people have to look at as, has this person ever competently run anything in the past? Is this person honest, and so on? And I think those, if we can get that culture shift, political culture shift, away from looking at political leadership as shouting slogans, violence, and leaders blaming others, irresponsible people, to try to get people who are more competent and more honest and more inclusive. We really have to begin to work on that as civil society, to change the public perception of what a political leader is all about. Sadly, there are many South Africans who wrongly think that if one color group or one ethnic group or one political party is in charge and excludes everyone else, that entity is going to deal with our problems, is going to give us growth and deal with our unemployment. That is not possible in a diverse society. In a diverse society, our strength, our economic growth, our jobs, our poverty alleviation comes from using all of the diversity all the time. I think it's a very, very important issue that we have to get across to all South Africans. I mean, there are many people, you look at some of the populist parties, EFF, MK, say, well, if we come to power, we exclude everyone, we're going to deliver jobs and so on. It's not going to be possible. We've seen it with the National Party when it was dominant. It's not sustainable. We've seen it with the ANC. It's been a majority party for 30 years, and it has been governing almost like if it was like a monopoly party, excluding everyone. It has not delivered jobs or growth and so on. So really the only way out, if the Trump meeting with Ramaphosa can concentrate our mind so that we can finally as a society accept the fact that our diversity is our strength. If we want to deal with all of the legacies of the past, if we want to transform our society, we can only do it collaboratively. We've had anti-growth policies. I mean, Trump has raised the issue of expropriation of farmers' lands. Obviously, he is wrong, but there is a truth also behind it. And the truth is behind it, we've got an expropriation law that endangered property rights, and that's the issue. And that is also why it is so difficult to dispel the Trump allegation. It is very, very important that we repeal this Expropriation Act, because it undermines property rights, not only of white farmers, but of everyone. I mean, if you think about America, society and American identity is a market economy and it's a property rights economy. Our expropriation law goes against a market economy and also goes against a property rights-based market economy. And that is the issue.
Prof, my last question to you is, when it comes to coalition governments, and we've said, okay, these coalition governments agreements need to be public and they need to be binding and they need to be enforceable. And We've spoken a bit about the enforcement mechanisms. The foundation, for its part, has recommended that if a party to a coalition agreement wants to leave, if they're on a local government coalition, they first need to prove that their exit won't undermine the objects of a municipality in the constitution, which are as we have already set out. And they would need to obtain either all the other coalition parties' consent or a court order releasing them from said agreement. Parties' failure to obtain such consent or a court order, as the case may be, will result in them being held liable for any obligations imposed by said agreement, and then you've gone even further by saying they should be held personally liable. Some of the concerns that have been raised are that this politicizes the courts, and that already coalitions are resulting in a politicization of the courts. So we've had the DA and MK run off about that, and then we have the DA running off about this Expropriation Act, and the result is that we are politicizing the courts. We're essentially asking the courts to decide political matters. Now, in terms of the Expropriation Act, I would argue that that falls strictly within interpretation of the Constitution's requirement for quote-unquote what just and equitable compensation means. So I would argue there's space for that within the legal system. But what is your response to having to enforce a coalition agreement and then we are politicizing the courts?
I disagree totally with the argument of politicizing the courts. We are a constitutional democracy. I think that's really important to understand. We're not a parliamentary democracy and we're not a presidential democracy. In a constitutional democracy, there's a really big role for the courts. I talked about early on how the courts can be used to change the culture, to make our political culture more democratic. And, it's not a courts that are to blame. It's the maturity of our political parties and politicians that are to blame. So the issue is not the people who go to court, or the issue is even not to the people. If AfroForum wants to go to the Trump administration, or if Jacob Zuma, who actually threatened that he's going to go to the ICJ to complain about the government, it's their right to do that.
Prof, those are very valid points to make, and it will be interesting to see. I know, for example, the charges of terrorism have been laid, and for those who are aware, the Protection of Constitutional Democracy Against Terrorism and Related Activities Act, commonly known as POCTATARA's definition of terrorism activity, or rather terrorist activity, is very wide. Prof, you've mentioned that politicians who have politics as their sole source of income. I would say this has probably also led to what has commonly become called a culture of political elitism or political elites. One of the things that we have spoken about internally as a foundation and brainstormed about is what is the return on investment? If we're saying you're a political office bearer and you're getting your salary paid by the taxpayers, what do the taxpayers and countries see as a return on that investment? And is it good enough? What are some of your solutions? Do you propose that perhaps politicians in public office should not earn salaries, that they should do it as their part-time jobs?
I would say what we need to do is actually reduce the salaries of elected representatives almost immediately. Take it down to at least half of what they get now. It is going to be a very, very important symbolic action. The country is in an economic crisis. We've got high unemployment, we've got low growth. So one of the symbolic things we can do I think that will galvanize the country, and it will show that politicians are actually genuinely serious about their constituencies that they claim to represent, who are poor, who are for the people, that we maybe have to take a haircut in the salaries of all elected representatives from at national level, the members of parliament, provincial, and at municipal level. And then what we also need to do parallel to that, we do something a little bit more nuanced in state entities. The income of board members of state-owned entities you can also have almost immediately at the same time. You can do the same thing. And then the entities that do not make a profit, that we almost immediately reduce the salaries of senior management. And this won't be new. This has happened in other countries. So during COVID, some countries, including China, reduced the salaries of senior management in state-owned entities. And some Western European countries did the same. They argue that, look, COVID brought about an economic crisis.
Prof, thank you very much for that. This has been an amazing interview with you. And we will say goodbye here. Thank you so much for joining us today, Prof. And we look forward to our next discussion.